Bismillahirrahmanirrahim and Assalamu alaikum. I welcome you all to the third day of this virtual conference, HeemCon 2021, and I am Dr. Nazir Saklen, Assistant Professor at the Children's Hospital, Lahore. I will be the moderator for this session, that is the blood transfusion, and I am sure that all of you must have enjoyed the academic sessions for the last 2 days. So let's get on to the transfusion medicine session. We are going to have 6 talks in this session. 3 talks will be the free papers by our young budding hematologist, followed by the talks by our eminent guest speakers. As panelists, we are very lucky to have such learned hematologists with us. We have Professor Dr. Nisar Ahmed, my mentor, my teacher. Sir is the head of hematology, bone marrow transplant and transfusion medicine department head. And at the Children's Hospital Lahore, he is also the former president, PSH Lahore. Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Walaikum salam.
And we have Professor Dr. Hassan Abbas Zahir. I hope he will join soon. Professor Hassan Abbas Zahir is the professor of pathology and transfusion medicine at Shaheed Zulfikar Ali Bhutto Hospital, Islamabad. He has a vast 20 years experience of teaching to the postgraduate students. He is one of the pioneers of safe blood transfusion program in Pakistan. Then we have Colonel Muhammad Sajid Yazdani. He is currently working as the CMH Aptabad, and he has a vast experience in the field of transfusion medicine. He is also a member of the Executive Council of PSH. Assalamu alaikum, sir. And before going to the talks, I would like to make important announcements. First of all, I request all the speakers to please stick to the allocated time. And another thing is that if any of our listeners wish to ask any questions from our speakers, please click on the Ask the Question icon on the virtual environment. And please make sure you identify yourself and whom you are asking. So coming back to our first speaker, she is Dr. Aisha Waqas. She is MPhil Hematology, working at Liaquat University of Medical Sciences, Jamshoro. The title of her talk will be Neonatal Thrombocytopenia and Platelet Transfusions. Please, Aisha.
Assalamu alaikum. I am Dr. Aisha Waqas, MPhil training resident in LUMS Jamshoro. Today's topic of my presentation is neonatal thrombocytopenia and platelet transfusion. No conflict of interest. Now the contents of my presentation is introduction, objective, material, methods, inclusion, exclusion criteria, methodology, results, comparison, conclusion, acknowledgement, and references. Introduction. Thrombocytopenia is one of the major hematological problems in neonatal intensive care units. Overall prevalence of thrombocytopenia in neonates ranges from the overall prevalence of thrombocytopenia in neonates ranges from 1 to 5%, and it is reported to be much higher in neonates admitted to neonatal intensive care units, that is ranging from 22 to 35%. It is more common among extremely low birth weight neonates, preterm neonates, or sick neonates. Early determination of risk factors can enable us to prevent irreversible complications of neonatal thrombocytopenia and related platelet transfusion. The objective is to determine the frequency, risk factors, and outcome of neonatal thrombocytopenia. It's a prospective study that is conducted in LUMS Hospital, Hyderabad from 1st July 2020 to 30th September 2020. We are included neonates of both genders, and we are excluded those neonates whose parents not given consent. Total sample size was 512 neonates. First of all, we have neonates admitted in neonatal intensive care units during study period having thrombocytopenia. Then we have recorded their data, including maternal and neonatal risk factors. Then we categorize these into 2 groups according to severity and time of onset of thrombocytopenia. These groups are, according to severity, these are the mild, moderate, and the severe, and according to onset, these are early on the late onset. Now the results. First of all, the demographic data, we have total 512 units, out of which 112 units having thrombocytopenia. Out of them, 45% are male and the 55% female. And out of 110 units having thrombocytopenia, 15 units receive platelet transfusion. Now, this is a graphical presentation that has a frequency of neonatal thrombocytopenia, that is the 21% units have thrombocytopenia out of 100%. Severity of thrombocytopenia is that 29, most of the units are in moderate thrombocytopenia, that is the 46% units are in the moderate thrombocytopenia, while the 29% in mild, and only 25% units are in severe thrombocytopenia. Time of onset is that most of the units are in late onset period, that means after 72 hours of life they develop thrombocytopenia. Only 37% of units are in early onset. That means they develop thrombocytopenia less than in first 3 days of life. Now, the maternal and the neonatal risk factors. Most common maternal risk factors in our setup is the pregnancy-induced hypertension, then premature rupture of membrane, and then anemia. Respectively, that is the 45% of the pregnancy-induced hypertension, premature rupture of membrane is the 30%, and anemia is 25%. And in neonatal risk factors, most commonly risk factor is the sepsis, that is 74%. Neonates having platelet transfusion, out of 512 units, we have 110 units that have thrombocytopenia, and out of these 110 units, only 15 units receive transfusion. Now, discussion. In this study, our prevalence is 18% of platelet transfusion. Most common risk factors we have pregnancy-induced hypertension, premature rupture of membrane, and anemia. And neonatal risk factors include sepsis and asphyxia. And prevalence of platelet transfusion in our setup is 13%. Meanwhile, same is prevalence in a study at Tubar-Kasab study in 2020, and a study conducted in Austria that also has a 21%, and that study conducted in Saudi Arabia that also has a 11.1% of prevalence platelet transfusion. Conclusion: this study shows that 21% of neonates admitted in neonatal intensive care units had thrombocytopenia, and 13% need platelet transfusion. Most common maternal and neonatal risk factors in our setup are pregnancy-induced hypertension and sepsis, respectively. On-time diagnosis, management, and care during antenatal period and in neonatal life would be effective in decreasing risk factors that ultimately decreases the development of thrombocytopenia in neonates. As neonatal thrombocytopenia is a reversible condition, in most of the time, risks and benefits should be weighed carefully before administering platelet transfusion to neonates. Future directions are: as neonatal thrombocytopenia is a reversible condition, so prompt diagnosis and careful management of maternal and neonatal risk factors were needed to avoid unnecessary transfusions. Further studies required regarding safe and evidence-based guidelines for platelet transfusion in neonates. I acknowledge my sorry to all my teachers and colleagues, Lumps Hospital, Hyderabad. References. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aisha. Please stay online and the question answer session will be at the end. The next speaker is Dr. Iram Habib. She is a postgraduate student from NUMS University, Islamabad, working as consultant hematologist. The title of her talk is Serological and Molecular Characterization of Blood Group A2 in Pakistan. Dr. Iram.
Assalamu alaikum, ma'am. Assalamu alaikum. I am Dr. Iram Habib, MPhil Hematology. The title of my talk is Serological and Molecular Characterization of Blood Group A2 in Pakistan. Blood Group A is the third most frequent blood group in Pakistan, and it can be categorized as A1, A2, and other weak A subgroups. Blood group A is the third most frequent blood group in Pakistan, and it can be categorized as A1, A2, and other weak A subgroups. In 1911, Von Dungen and Hirschfeld, they categorized blood group A into A1 and A2 as the prime subgroups of blood group A. Weak variants of blood group A are categorized based on antigenic concentration, different serological reactions, and presence of anti-A1 antibodies, and include A3, AX, AL, AM, AF, and many others. There have been many differences which are documented. They can be quantitative as well as qualitative. The number of cell surface antigens which are observed in a single A1 erythrocyte is about zero point 0.8 and zero point 0.8 to 1.2 into 10 raised to power 6, while the number of antigens on a single A2 erythrocyte is about zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.4 into 10 raised to power 6. Lesser antigenic load in A2 erythrocytes they lead to the more expression of H substance. Anti-A1 antibodies, they exist in 1.8 to 2% of individuals with A2 subgroups. Anti-A1 antibodies usually belong to IgM class, which is active only up to 25 degrees C, and this rarely they can cause hemolytic transfusion reactions. It usually results in ABO blood group discrepancies, and more time is spent in finding a compatible blood group. However, in clinical transfusion practices, if A1 red cell products are transfused to the individual with A2 blood groups, anti-A1 of IgG class is developed, which is active at 37 degrees C, and it is capable of causing hemolytic transfusion reaction and severe hemolytic anemia. Serological testing was considered a gold standard technique for blood grouping. Lesser antigenic load, recent blood transfusions, and diseases, they are major limitations of serological testing. A2 and weak variants of blood group A, they gave similar reactions on serological testing with A1 lectin. Therefore, there is a need of more sensitive and specific DNA-based testing to differentiate. Although the genotyping is considered more accurate, presence of a particular gene does not necessarily mean its expression on the surface of red cells. Therefore, the molecular technique should complement serology rather than replacing it. The objective of my study was to determine the prevalence of blood group A to genotype among group A Pakistani whole blood donors. This study was cross-sectional descriptive, and it was conducted in Armed Forces Institute of Transfusion, Rawalpindi, from 1st January to 31st December 2019. The whole blood donors coming to Armed Forces Institute of Transfusion, fulfilling the blood donation criteria, irrespective of gender and ethnicities, they were included in my study. And the individuals or the donors who did not fit into the donor selection criteria, or who were the first degree relatives of donor, and the donors who did not give consent to the participate in study, they were excluded. Material and method. ABO and RH forward typing was performed on EDTA preserved whole blood using blood grouping reagents, which from Lornay Laboratories, UK, according to the manufacturer's instruction. All samples with blood group A were further subtyped serologically with commercially available anti-A1 lectin, and they were labeled as A1 and non-A1 blood groups. The blood samples who gave a strong agglutination, they were labeled as A1, and those who gave no agglutination or a weak reaction, they were labeled as non-A1. The samples who were labeled as non-A1, their DNA was extracted from EDTA preserved whole blood, and using the Kygene DNA extraction kit according to the manufacturer's instruction. Sequence of A2 gene was selected as described by Gessner and confirmed from NCBI website. For amplification sequence, sequence-specific primers of A2, they were used. This sequence of A2 sense and antisense and AGH, HDH, which is used as a positive internal control, this sequence was used. In each PCR reaction mixture, human growth hormone was used as an internal control. Concentration of sequence-specific primer was 2.5 picomoles, while that of AGH control was 0.25 picomoles. The volume for one reaction mixture was 17.5 microliters, which consisted of 15 microliters of PCR buffer, 1.5 of genomic DNA, and 1 microliters of sequence-specific primers. The PCR reaction mixture used was a DreamTag Green PCR Master Mix, which is of a double strength of thermoscientific CAD number K1081. Control samples were prepared which contain AGH primer, DNA, and buffer, whereas the blank samples, they contained only sequence-specific primer and buffer. Amplification of gene product of interest in the PCR mixture was done in a thermocycler with the conditions of initial denaturation at 95 degrees C for 120 seconds, 5 incubation cycles for 30 seconds and 95 degrees C, 150 seconds and 59 degrees C, and 15 seconds and at 72 degrees C. 30 incubation cycles at 95 degrees C for 30 seconds and 61 degrees C for 60 seconds. And 72 degrees C for 15 seconds and 2 minutes at 72 degrees C. The last step was gel electrophoresis, and it was carried out on a vertical STS page gel system. It consists of a 6% polyacrylamide gel and was run at 200 volts for 30 minutes. The gel was stained with 0.1% silver nitrate and counter-stained with a mixture of 1.5% sodium hydroxide and 37% of formaldehyde. After appearance of visible band, gel was washed and transferred to a filter paper. This was the final product. The base pair of A2 band was 169 base pairs, and this is a ladder which shows that this is 100 and 200, and the bands which lie in between, they are 169 base pair, and these bands are of A2 band. Result on serology with anti-A1 lectin. My sample size was 247, 202 donors. They were labeled as N1, A1, and the remaining 45% were non-A1. With the further genotyping of 45 for 38, they gave positive A2 band, while the 7 they did not give any band, and they were negative for A2. A discussion. This in Pakistan on the prevalence of blood group A2 in genotype. Prevalence of blood group in India is approximately 95.8% and 4.1% with anti-A1 lectin. And another study from West India, they has described the similar result, showing prevalence of A2 on using anti-A1 typing to be around 3%. And a study from South India, they showed the frequency of A1 and A2 on serology to be 98.1% and 1.8% respectively. These results are in clear contrast to our study. Similarly, in Chinese population, their frequency was found to be 99.4% and 0.6%. Consistent results are obtained in Japan, where the frequency of A1, A2, and other variants is estimated to be around 99.7%, 0.09%, and 0.12% respectively. Many A2 related alleles they have been identified, and it is stated that allele A204 allele is responsible for the decreased prevalence of blood group A2 in Japan and China. Our present study findings are closer to the study conducted in Caucasians, showing prevalence of A1 and A2 to be around 80% and 20% respectively. Prevalence of A2 genotype has been described in some of the studies. In a study conducted in China, 88% of serologically A2 positive samples, they were classified as A2 related alleles on DNA sequence analysis. Frequency of A2 genotyping using a multiplex PCR method in Kuwaiti donor was 8.7%. Discordance between the serology and genotyping of A2 subgroups have been observed in my study. Non-A1, non-A2 subgroups, which were found on genotyping, they require further studies to characterize the exact subgroups. Conclusion, blood group A2 is quite prevalent subgroup in our population. Vast majority of non-A1 blood groups were genotypically confirmed as A2. But 28.8% were neither A1 nor A2, that is, they are the other weak variants of blood group A. Samples which were not resolved on genotyping could be other known A subgroup, or it can be a novel mutation in A gene. Further characterization with molecular method and allele frequency studies are needed for the better characterization and understanding of its clinical significance. PCR using sequence-specific primer is a preferred technique compared with the serology using anti-A1 lectin for establishing the blood group status of an individual. These are the references. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eram. The next talk, which is by Dr. Sabah Jamal with the title Blood Transfusion Safety in Pakistan, Past, Present, and Future. Dr. Sabah needs no introduction when it comes to the evolution of blood transfusion services in this country. She is currently working as National Director, Blood Transfusion Services and Clinical Laboratories at Indus Health Network. She holds triple US boards in hematology, anatomic, and clinical pathology. She is providing consultancy services to leading blood transfusion services in Pakistan and internationally. Dr. Sabah has a key role in conception and development of a blood banking management information system. We all know that she has a pivotal role in the development and functioning of centralized regional blood centers in Pakistan. Dr. Sabah, over to you.
Thank you very much, and we'll proceed with this. It was interesting when I did a literature search. Okay, at the time of independence, what was the condition? We had only 4 blood banks: Karachi, Hyderabad, Lahore, and Peshawar. And then there is a big gap, and I didn't want to talk about it repeatedly. It's been the same issues. Interestingly, then I did a literature search to see till when we have documented evidence, meaning in literature, about paid and remunerated donors. Initially, of course, it was all, most of it was remunerated and paid donors. To my surprise, I found 2 papers published in good journals. JPMA, this is 2006. And if you see the highlighted, out of 37, there 25
excuse me,
are
Dr.
operational,
Sabah.
and whether
We can't see your screen. Please share your screen. Yeah, we can see your screen now. Thank you.
can you see the screen?
Yes, we can see the screen now.
So even today, I think a lot of us are very suspicious that the family donors भी क्या ये paid इनमें से कुछ हैं. Then in 80s, we saw the epidemic of HIV and AIDS, and it increased the focus of the world, in fact, to improve the blood safety in 80s. And I think I've talked to a couple of people, when was this replacement donors introduced? It was around the same time in Pakistan, the concept of family and replacement donors came up in the 80s, around 85, 86. At least in Karachi. But we have stuck to that. And if you see what's going on now, most of it is fragmented, it's demand driven. Whenever we need blood, family gathers and gets the blood. And it's mostly public, private sector blood banks. In Karachi and Sindh, there are more NGOs compared to other areas where it's mostly public sector. Then about 2.7 to 3 million blood donations are collected. This is an approximation. I personally feel I'll show you some data which has been shared by the different government sector. And I think it's a little bit more than that, and there's a deficiency. There's a problem of documentation also. Because a lot of unknown number of small labs are also providing unregulated, undocumented service, mostly in smaller cities, but also even in bigger cities. I think they are still functioning. In the larger blood bank sector of the public sector, which is largely responsible for providing blood, we see a lot of pilferage, and now we have a lot of experience also, and we see these mushrooming of small blood banks in front of the each public sector hospital, and the families either draw blood in the public sector and then they carry the blood, and so there is a lot of pilferage, and I'll show you some data that will prove it. Blood banks are mostly managed by medical officers in the public sector, which are only MBBS, or by pathologists without any regulated postgraduate qualification. Most of the blood bank technologists are trained on the job. There are few who are MLT, but most of them are on the job. Yes, people will say there is the other spectrum in the larger cities of better blood banks, of international standards, who are following international standards, but that's really small number. In bigger cities, you can count them on finger, 8, 10, 12, and contributing to maybe less than 10 to 15% of the total country's requirement. So largely, it's very, very suboptimal. What is the quality of blood? Heavy reliance on family replacement donor. Yes, voluntary donors have been started, but still that's less than 10-15% of the entire country. There is lack of proper pre-donation screening of donors for high-risk behaviors. Most of the places don't even ask any questions. If they ask, they just say, jaundice to nahi hua tha, koi aur tabiyat sahi hai, and then they are asked to donate. Most of the places are using poor quality, rapid manual devices and for TBI testing, and we all know what is the quality of those, and in many of them, of these public sector hospitals, even those there is a pilferage of those TTI testing manual devices. Blood donor seroprevalence and our indices data is similar. Varies hepatitis B from 2 to 8, and also for HCV, it's about up till 9%, and it's very scary. Yes, this is how it is. Mostly incomplete blood grouping is performed, even that is performed on tiles, and most of it is or on slides. Almost 90%, I think, 95% reverse grouping is not performed. And of course, there is no documentation of transfusion reactions. When you talk in the government sector, the clinicians really talk about a lot of hemolytic transfusion reactions, but those are never reported. And I think it's because of this incomplete blood grouping or just on the slide, on the tile, and improper training. Thalassemia and hemophilia patients, it's estimated that about 1/4 of the national annual blood collections are transfused to these thalassemia patients, or hemophilia get other products. Thalassemia cases have really limited access to proper healthcare, and we have heard the condition of thalassemia care in the earlier talks in the last 2 days. And there's no national unified thalassemia registry, and most of it is performed, these patients are handled either by NGOs and very few public sector sites. These services are unregulated and give insufficient transfusion as well as medical coverage. And up to 60% of these patients, whether they be thalassemia or hemophilia, have been reported as positive for hepatitis B or C. So it's a very pathetic condition, and this needs to be organized better, organized across Pakistan. What happened and what is the reforms? What are the reforms? And I would like to thank Safe Blood Transfusion Program, the 2019 report, which was very helpful for me. I reviewed that. Dr. Hassan Zaheer is here. Thank you. In 2008, I've just taken out some of the salient features. Blood safety reforms were initiated by the government through Pak-German Joint Project. Ministry of Health established blood transfusion programs at the national and provincial levels as the independent entities in 2010. In 2011, however, there was this health sector decentralization by 18th Amendment, which slowed down the process a lot. In again 2014, Safe Blood Transfusion Program formulated the national program policy, blood policy and strategic framework for 2014 till 20. Of course, 2020 has gone. And the legislative framework of the blood transfusion services started earlier in 1997 from Sindh. And you can see as you go along, up till 2017, these three have been repealed and the new acts have been passed, 16 and in 17 in KP, Punjab and Sindh. It is now under implementation, but there are still major gaps in implementation. And of course, whatever standards have been written, most of them may or may not be followed. What was the financial cooperation? There has been a lot of money put in, there has been a lot of focus. EPOS is the health management company that was implementing, has been implementing, it is now merged with GOPA. And since September 2010, the first phase was for 15 million euros. That's a lot of money for 10 regional blood centers. Now all 10 are functional. A lot of them were functionalized later, and I'll talk about till what level. In these 10 centers, each center was supposed to be connected to 6 hospital blood banks, and a lot of equipment was also given to those 6 sites. The phase 2 started in 2017, and another 10 million euros have been given in grant in aid from German Development Bank. And you can see these 10 are now functional. Karachi, Shaheed Benazirabad, Peshawar, Jamshoro, Multan, Gilgit, Sakhar, Quetta, Bhalpur, and Muzaffarabad, AJK. And in the next phase, these are coming up, which are new: Faisalabad, Shahabad, Ahmedabad, DI Khan, Skardu. These are the regional blood centers that are being constructed from scratch and are near completion. I visited Islamabad RBC, a beautiful building, really a beautiful building. I hope it's run as beautifully as the building is beautiful. These in phase 2 also, a number of HVBs are being upgraded, which are already there. In Punjab, funding is given and equipment is being given to Mayo Hospital and Lahore General Hospital. In Sindh, Civil Hospital Karachi, Jinnah Hospital, Sindh Government Hospital Korangi, and Fatmid Foundation Blood Bank. In Balochistan, DHU Hospital Turbat, the NGO called Baloch Blood Bank in Quetta, and in Quetta also Pakhtunkhwa Blood Bank, and in AJK, DHQ Hospital, Mirpur. So this is a lot of money put in, a lot of effort put in of the phase 1 RBCs. I'll come to the Sindh RBCs later on. I'll discuss from Punjab, Multan and Bhavalpur regional blood centers are running in public-private partnership with the Indus Health Network is running it, and Multan has been connected to Nishtar Hospital, and Bhalpur has been connected to Bhabal Victoria Hospital. Because of lack of funding, other hospital blood banks have yet to be connected to these RBCs. There's a lot of capacity in them. Interestingly, these RBCs were made initially with the thought process of 50,000 donors, catering to those, but both these sites, just with Bhabal Victoria and Nishtar, these sites have exceeded 50,000, and we see still massive capacity in them, residual capacity. So my thought is, looking at the residual capacity, that probably these RBCs would be able to handle around about 200,000 to 300,000 donors annually. We will have to test it out and see how far we can go. With Gilgit and Muzaffarabad, as well as Peshawar, not many large blood banks have been connected. In Peshawar, there is a limited connection to a couple of hospitals, but it's not catering to full loads yet. Now let's go to these. What is the current requirement? This is phase 1. In phase 1, after phase 1, SWAT RBC has been constructed by the KPK government and it has been operationalized. To what level, I don't know. And these are in phase 2, either the governments are building it or the KFW has given the funding. And these are what we have. Indus Health Network team has done an extensive workup from taking data from different governments, and this is what we have recommended, another 9. So initially, I think 30 RBCs should be able to handle most of the load, and later on, these can be then connected. However, before building more RBCs, we need to operationalize all the phase 1 RBCs to their full capacity, connecting them to the HBBs and the phase 2 also. Then the government should be putting in money on the RBCs. And I'll show you what is the status of operationalization of RBCs and hospital blood banks in Sindh. In the Sindh, the government had decided to go with public-private partnership for all 4 regional blood centers, and now they have been operationalized. There was a major delay, but later on, these have all been awarded. RBC Jamshoro is being run by Indus Hospital, and LUMS University Hospital Blood Bank has been operationalized, connected. Civil Hospital Hyderabad has been connected, Civil Hospital Thatta, and Civil Hospital Badin. However, the remaining 3 sites are still pending because of lack of provision of funding. This battle has been going on. We've been pushing the government to release the remaining funds, and let's see what happens. In RBC Sakhar, is being run by Sakhar Blood Bank. This is an NGO-run Sakhar Blood Bank, which had been providing services for a very long time in Sakhar. This was awarded to them. And as per my latest information, they have connected Sakhar, Larkana, Khairpur, Jacobabad, and Shikarpur. The remaining is still pending. The last but not the least, RBC Shaheed Benazirabad and RBC Karachi were awarded to FATMI. This was awarded, I think, last year, so it's not been that long. And they have, alhamdulillah, already connected Civil Hospital of HBB of Shaheed Benazirabad, the previous Nawab Shah, and Qatar Hospital. So hopefully they will be moving forward and connecting the remaining as time goes by. So this is, I think, one of the largest network of the concept of RBCs and HBBs, which is now existing in Sindh. So Sindh may have started late, but is catching up and has left the other provinces behind in creating the network of RBCs and HBBs. This is what we did gap analysis and took the data from different provincial governments, and Indus team has done some homework on this. What are the needs of national needs? This is with a pinch of salt because I think Sindh and AJK data is incomplete still from the government side. And if you see a total of 286, I think it would be around 350 if all data comes in. And again, this is public sector. This is not does not include private and NGO sector, and this is covering about 65,000 beds. And this is of 3 different caters: teaching hospitals, district headquarter hospitals, and then tehsil headquarter hospitals. And if you look at this, the HR requirements according to the needs, according to the size, HR requirement, if you look just with incomplete data, it's about about 155 blood transfusion specialists are needed at this point in the country, which I think would go up to around 200 or 250. And at least medical officers or trainees or junior level officers who have some information or qualification of blood transfusion, about 300 are needed. So what's the problem? Are they available? No, there is complete lack of educated, specialized doctors as well as technologists, and which is not meeting the demand. The demand has gone up. There is inadequate curriculum content and training wherever, if there is some, it's being taught in MLT programs or in some diploma programs. Most of the blood banks, as I said before, are being managed by medical officers without appropriate knowledge and skills. And if you look at this location of blood establishments and training sites, these are the ones that we think should be present in the country. And these are the hospital blood banks that we discussed before, placed on the map. And if you look at this, these are the sites which have FCPS hematology training programs, and you can see the gap. In between, in Hyderabad, now we have MPhil hematology also. There may be some here, but overall, it's a major gap between training and the need, the demand. And of the training, even in FCPS hematology, blood bank is one of the components. And when you are running the regional blood centers, we now have the experience, much more information, knowledge, expertise is required to run these sites optimally. What is the solution of these HR needs, which is suddenly have gone up, is that multiple level of transfusion medicine specialists are required. For regional blood centers, you require a higher level of expertise. Then for teaching hospitals, you require something similar. But in regional blood center, you require a lot of administrative know-how also and experience, which is required less in teaching hospitals. But here, you require a lot of clinical experience of blood banking. And then in the smaller blood banks, specifically in Tehsil headquarter or district headquarter hospitals in the rural areas. So there is a different level of needs in these three level of facilities. What is the way forward to meet this high demand of transfusion medicine specialists? We need to develop exclusive focused training programs of transfusion medicine in collaboration with universities and HEC, and we require MPhil transfusion medicine, which is should be a dedicated field which would be producing dedicated focused individuals who have specialized transfusion medicine expertise. Other Muslim countries have gone towards masters. I have reviewed the strategy of Iran, Turkey, etc. They have master's program for blood transfusion specialists, doctors, and those are now leading the field. And of course, we feel very strongly at Indus that another level for Tehsil headquarter or district headquarter hospital in rural areas, 1 year postgraduate diploma in transfusion medicine is also a need, where the local people living there should be trained in the regional blood center, and then they would stay there and be able to provide services. What about the blood bank technologists? Again, a 2-year associate degree program, which has been introduced by HEC for market-driven fields which require rapid capacity building. This was introduced in 2016, and HEC is now focusing a lot on this. as well, and this can be run in these regional blood centers. Well, 2021 saw the first steps towards this demand-driven capacity building measures. National University of Medical Sciences in Rawalpindi, run by Armed Forces, has taken this first bold step. They have started this year with the first batch MPhil in transfusion medicine in Armed Forces Institute of Transfusion for medical doctors. Indus Hospital has been affiliated and recognized by National University of Medical Sciences as a partner for 4 sites for associate degree program in blood transfusion medicine in Karachi, Jamshoro, Multan, and Bhalpur regional blood centers. As we speak, admissions are open for this 2-year program, and hopefully this should build a lot of capacity. And I think almost all regional blood centers need to initiate this program to be able to provide well-trained technologists in their regions. Let me talk about what we have discovered, what are the issues, and in the routine, this is what is happening in Pakistan at this point in time, still with 10 RBCs already functional, but 90% of the country's need is being met by the replication of the hospital blood bank with all the facilities there. This is a very expensive undertaking, and that's why then shortcuts are taken because you cannot fulfill all the requirements in every blood bank. Especially the TTI testing and screening requires loads when the instruments have to be placed. The component production is an expensive undertaking too. So because of that, there is a lot of duplication, and where you don't have the funds for duplication, these blood banks take shortcuts for this. What is a regional blood center? If you see, these are the steps, and the regional blood centers should not be doing compatibility testing or transfusion. That's the point of the hospital blood banks. The international model says that there have to be 2 types of systems. But what we have seen in Pakistan after working extensively, we worked extensively with the Punjab government, and we realized we have to think out of the box, and more different type of facilities have to be defined for the transition period. Because at this point in time, in the world, these regional blood centers ideally should be drawing blood from voluntary blood donors, and it should be all 100% voluntary blood donors fulfilling the country's need, any country's need. And then we should be distributing the blood through transportation into the entire regions. However, whenever a country moves from one system to another, there has to be an intermediate solution for this transition. Yes, voluntary blood donation activities have started in almost all RBCs at different levels, but those have, alhamdulillah, started. That's a good thing. We are focusing on that, but it will take a decade or 2 of very, very hard work to move to complete voluntary blood donation. And while we were making the budgets and we were seeing how to make blood available, because most of the Tehsil headquarter hospitals actually do not have blood banks. And some of the DHQs also, dedicated blood banks are not there. The lab is drawing it. And so what we then came up with a mini RBC. These are the bigger district headquarter hospitals because we are first trying to get the safety and better safe blood from the replacement donors. So what we realized was that we need to make some mini RBCs, which we gave the name mini RBCs, where we are not doing TTI testing. All TTI testing is being shifted for CLIA to the regional blood center, only the tubes are being transported. The production and etc. is being done because these district headquarter or teaching hospitals have massive loads and draw. So if these teaching hospitals are close to the regional blood center, for example, within 45 minutes, then we even don't do transport, what we call component preparation. We shift everything to, even for component preparation, to RBC, and the product comes back. But the blood is collected there. But those DHQs that are further away or teaching hospitals from the regional blood center, they have to prepare the components because it has to be components have to be made in a fast track time. So we don't do TTI testing. It's all goes to the regional blood center, and it brings the cost down. Then you need HBB collection. That's what we were saying, that what we do for teaching hospitals or DHQs that are very close to the regional blood centers. We do the collection there, take the blood to regional blood center and onwards, and then the traditional hospital blood banks that are defined in the Western or the developed Muslim countries where voluntary blood donation is working very well. So these are the ideal ones. What we have seen is that these would be, we are aiming that Tehsil headquarter hospitals which require very low level of blood can be made in this form. So this has been shared, and this reduces the implementation cost, the capital investments, and running expense also. We have done our working, and this work has been done for entire Punjab. And you can see we have shown this regional blood center, mini regional blood center, hospital blood banks, and hospital blood bank collection. And gap analysis has been done, and this has also been shared. And these presentations have been given to the Secretary Health of Punjab multiple times, trying to make them take a decision in phasing out. In fact, for Southern Punjab, the Punjab government requested us to give us another model for phase 2 for Multan, DG, Khan, etc. region, Muzaffargarh, etc. And we then realized, again for implementation, and this model came up, that it has to be a hub, spoke, and a bead model. The hub is the Multan RBC. The like here, these big teaching hospitals, which are in 30 minutes driving time to the RBC, we collect and bring all the blood here, do the production, do the processing, the TTI testing, and the blood is moved back. The components are moved back again. But then these are the spokes. These are the bigger district headquarter hospitals which are further away. And these are the smaller Tehsil headquarter hospital which are connected to the district headquarter hospital, which each district headquarter will be providing the blood without any replacement donors to these Tehsil headquarters. So just a hub and a spoke model does not work here when we practically wanted to do it at a very low cost, very low level of budgets. They said that this is the amount, you have to bring it within this amount. And this has already been submitted to the Southern Punjab Secretary Health. Now we have a separate Secretary Health for Southern Punjab and another, and then one sitting in Lahore. And the budgets have also been given. We have explained to them that Islamabad Blood Center should be used also for the Punjab hospitals which are within reach in Rawalpindi, etc., rather than putting in more capital investment. And if you see, all these calculations have been given that just in central Punjab and Islamabad capital territory, about 1.6 million donors are required, and these are the patient blood groups and the cross matching that is required. And these would be really, if you can see, 1.6 million to 3 points, providing blood to 3.6 million patients. And this is possible because what we have done in these public sector hospitals is close the loop, meaning the patient's family does not take the blood to the family and it doesn't get wasted or pilferaged. Even for OT, we have our own kiosk inside the OT theaters, and blood is kept there within the blood bank fridges. And if it's not used during the surgery, it's brought back, and it's because the cold chain is maintained. And similarly, the blood bank has blood distributors that take the blood to the patient's bed and get it signed. So it's a closed loop, and then we request for empty blood banks. Our blood distributors go back and get the empty blood banks. So it's closed. So all pilferage is being stopped in the areas where we are working, and we get about 25 to 30% excess blood which can be moved to the Tehsil headquarter hospitals without donors at a very low cost. If you see, this is for Southern Punjab. Those who are from Southern Punjab, they can see that all sites we have recommended. These are two already there, Multan and Bhalpur, and lastly for India Khan in phase 3. The grand summary, if you see, is donor collection is just, that's why I was saying that I think Pakistan needs more. 1.9 to 2 million units are needed in Punjab only. And the cross match is around 4.5, 4.6 million. I know this seems like a very huge, big dream. It has taken us a whole year of the whole team's hard work of doing gap analysis, working day and night, and getting these data out. But we all feel that when we dream alone, you are sleeping. It's a dream. But when you dream together, a big group of people dream together, it becomes a reality, because then you are dreaming with your open eyes. And now with so many sites already operational, it is doable. And I'm addressing the Hematology Society here. I think we need to do our part also in improving our blood banks. Everything is not based on money. For example, history taking, pre-donor screening, just requires implementation of processes. The sincerity that we should be asking the question and ensuring in our blood banks that these are asked, ensuring that testing is done, ensuring that products are being produced, and ensuring that reverse blood grouping is being performed. Week B testing is being performed for the blood donors. It's an essential thing. Cross-match is being performed. We all know that most of the sites are not doing cross-matching. It's only group to group, and we are basically turning a blind eye. But I think if all of us hematologists work together, this is a doable thing. And if we today make a resolution that we will all play our small part in whatever is under our control, we can bring this change. Thank you very much. Questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Sabha, for this enlightening talk. We can take the question and sessions at the end of the session.
Okay.
So the next guest speaker, I must say the host speaker, because she is Professor Nuzhat Mushahid. She is going to deliver a talk on vitality of pre-storage leukoreduction in blood banking landscape of country. She is the CEO and technical consultant at P First Solutions, Rawalpindi. Professor Nuzhat has the honor of commanding Armed Forces Institute of Transfusion Medicine and a proud recipient of Tamai Imtiaz Military. I know that she is a great teacher and she has a great passion to teach. I would like to quote Socrates here. As he said, I cannot teach anybody anything, I can only make them to think. And Brigadier Nuzhat Mushahid has done this thing very well. So, ma'am, over to you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Nazish, thank you very much for kind introduction. I'll try to make up for a little short. We are running off time. Is my screen visible now? Okay, thank you. After Dr. Sabha's talk on the status that we are in country regarding transfusion and blood banking landscape, it may seem pretty pessimistic, but there are silver linings, and Indus Hospital taking the initiative to organize and running 2 of the regional centers is one big silver lining, and we hope. And the second one that we can see is the starting of this MPhil program by NAMS. So I think things seems to be moving in the right direction, and we hope and we pray that we are able to deliver on this front, which is very vital, and especially to meeting the sustainable development goals. Okay, what I have chosen this topic to talk about is viability of pre-storage leukofiltration. Leukofiltration is one of the interventions to prepare leukodepleted products. This has been widely adopted world over. However, it remains and appears to remain elusive for our population and country for different reasons, but one of the reasons is probably lack of appreciation and knowledge about the options available. Can it be made viable with these options? That is what I'm going to talk briefly with a little background and preamble. That whether we can look into these, the benefit of this intervention in our population. Broadly speaking, the aims of blood transfusion is to support patients in different settings to improve clinical outcomes, to maximize the benefit and minimize the harms. Unfortunately, blood transfusion has been notorious because of the historical facts about transfusion-transmitted infection that it has been, sometimes interventions has been introduced in the absence of high quality evidence, primarily because of difficulty in conducting trials and secondarily because of the precautionary principle that is embedded in the history, which we can talk some other time, and in last PSH I did present this perspective on precautionary principle. Also, these interventions, transfusion services work as an industry and industrial scale, so these interventions have to be taken into a different perspective as compared to the rest of the clinical services. But the holy grail remains to find a balance between benefit, minimizing the harm and wastage, and cost effectiveness, especially in countries like ours. Here is a slide which briefly shows if you have unmodified blood products, that is the number of leukocytes which are present in each product. And here is another view of looking, if you look at these, the human leukocyte molecules, which are not only present onto the cells, but also they can be present in soluble forms. In the process of destruction of leukocytes during the storage, they do come off and they can be present and they are problematical, as we can see. So what problems actually these HLA antigens entail? Just to look at the basics, the platelets harbor mostly class 1 HLA antigens, while the leukocytes of all types have both class 1 and class 2 HLA antigens, and these class 2 HLA antigens are the one which are problematical, and they are very essential to initiate the immune responses. The way these HLA antigens initiate the immune responses within the recipient are 2 mechanisms. One of them is called direct antigen presentation, where the antigen presenting cells of the donor within the blood product, that is, for example, the monocytes and B cell, would present the HLA antigens to the recipient immune system, the cellular part, that is the helper cells, and this then result in release of cytokines, and they then stimulate the B cells for proliferate and ultimately form the anti-HLA antibodies. So remember, it's the antigen-presenting cells within the donor which presents the antigen to the recipient, and then recipient immune response is initiated, leading to formation of anti-HLA antibody, which remain there once these are triggered. So these are basically, the antigen presented is mainly the class 2 molecules. Now, in 20% of the cases, where even if you remove the leukocytes, then there is a possibility of having these immune responses initiated by virtue of the second process, which is called the indirect antigen presentation. What happens in this is that the recipient antigen presenting cells, they take up the donor HLA molecules and they present them to their own immune systems, triggering the immune response, resulting in production of anti-HLA antibodies. And these remain in the recipient for times to come. Now, what problems once these anti-HLA antibodies are formed, cause for a recipient? Whenever the blood product containing the donor leukocytes are infused and the patient has already been sensitized in the setting of previous transfusion, or in case of ladies, the pregnant ladies previously who has potential of developing anti-HLA immune antibodies to their because of the fetus, these will react with the donor leukocytes, and they will form antigen-antibody complex, leading to complement activation, and this then finally results into breakage and stimulation of the macrophages and release of the cytokines. These are the cytokines which result in the reaction, the clinical reaction. The second thing that happens because of these antibodies is that once the recipient has HLA antibodies and the platelets are transfused, they have mainly the HLA class 1 antigen to which the recipient has been immunized. These antibodies will react with the platelet class 1 HLA antigens. The immune complexes will be cleared from the spleen, as well as they would lead to immune destruction. And this is what results in this is the phenomena which is the basis of refractoriness to the platelet once there is a repeated platelet transfusion historically. And this is the third effect. If you have the leukocytes, they can harbor the CMV virus. And this becomes very notorious in the setting when the immune system is suppressed in immunosuppression, in hem-onc setting, then these viruses are the main problem. And since they are harbored by the leukocytes in the donor blood, so it would be pragmatic that we take out these leukocytes in order to get rid of the CMV going into the recipient blood. Now, over the time, because of what I have narrated just, that the leukocytes, by virtue of these pathophysiological phenomena, would lead to certain clinical effects. And since this evidence is still a work in progress, some of these clinical effects of these aluminization are proven. For example, they are responsible for non-hemolytic febrile transfusion reaction. They transmit CMV. They are the reasons for HLA aluminization and platelet refractoriness, and also stronger evidence is emerging that they cause mortality and organ dysfunction in cardiovascular surgery. The less likely clinical benefit which are yet to be proven are the TRIM effect, reduction of TTI, especially the prawn disease, and also some other viruses. We'll not talk about that. The most important thing is, which has been proven, we have strong evidence that removal of the leukocytes from the donor blood products would result in reduction of these. Now the question is what level of leuko reduction would actually result in translating this into a clinical benefit. So over the time we have found out that if you reduce the WBCs to the level of less than 5 million per product, as far as the USA standards concerned, or less than 1 million, the European standard, this will translate into a clinically beneficial effect and meet the standards. Quantitatively, we traditionally describe the reduction of leukocyte as log reduction, and over the time, the intervention, the one which is we are going to currently talk about is that is leukofiltration. It is possible and it is capable of reducing the WBCs 1,000 times, which is 3 log reduction. And this is the criteria and standards which we have to meet to call a product a leukodepleted. In addition to the usual standard for other non-modified products like hemoglobin, there are additional standards of quality control to prove that actually the leukodepletion of that extent has been achieved. Now, as far as the timings are concerned, the standards are variable, and that is what I'm going to touch upon shortly. Okay, so once we have proved that leukocytes are of no good use, they are of no help, they do not benefit in any way, rather they are a problem, and they can clinically harm the patient. So the question arises whether we can take out these leukocytes from the blood products effectively so that we can get a meaningful clinical result. Yes, we can do that, and over the time, there have been different simpler and more sophisticated techniques to do it. Easiest would be to make buffy coat removal, which we traditionally, even now in our country, widespread. Whenever you have to tackle febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction, we do it. Yes, it helps to some extent, but it leads to loss of product, as well as opening the system and putting it in risk. In addition, you have other interventions like cell washing. This is something I'm not talking about, although it does, freezing the blood product and deglycerization would result in loss of leukocytes. But the most important one that I'm going to touch is the leukofiltration, which is also a topic of today's discussion, and just briefly touch upon the apheresis part of it. And there's a reason to why I want to touch the apheresis part. So apheresis leukodepletion, whatever equipment we are employing, most of them are equipped with capability to reduce leukocytes and with what we call as leukocyte reduction systems. That is, during collection, you would be able to reduce the leukocyte to the extent which will meet standards, for example, in these equipment. Then secondly, you can have the kit which has inbuilt filters in it, for example, in these equipment, or if they are unable to leukoreduce here, there remains the option that you can leukoreduce the apheresis product after collection. Now, as far as apheresis is concerned, I just want to add that it is unfortunate that people sometimes think that leukofiltration is only possible through apheresis, which remains a very, very expensive way. But now there are options that once you have reduced the leukocytes from any collection, it would be called as an apheresis equivalent product. So apheresis should not be solely used to leukoreduce product for the sake of leukoreduction. Okay, historically speaking, let's not go into the detail of it, but over the time, the technology development led to finally the first generation of cellulose acetate filters, which were able to reduce leukocytes to 98%. And then the technology progressed, and finally we have third generation filters, which are specifically employed to free it off from leukocytes, and they can meet the standards of reducing its number to 3 logs to up to 5 million or less. What are these leukofilters composed of? They are mainly these 3 types of, these are the main 3 constituents, and these are the example of these. And how do they do it? They do it by blocking, by bridging, by interception, and adhesion to its fibers and whatever the composition they have. And most of the leukofilters have all the mechanisms which come into play. Now, what are the stages or what are the processes during which we can actually leukofilter blood component? They can be done at blood centers. I mean, this is a slide, of course, borrowed from those places where they have a well-organized transfusion services, where they have neatly divided into blood centers and hospital laboratory and hospital blood bank. But nevertheless, just to give you a concept that you are able to filter the blood at different stages. And these 2 are the one which are not at the bedside. So you can leukofilter before the blood reaches the bedside. And that is in the domain of the blood banks and the transfusion center. Now, what would be the considerations of selecting and timing of leukodepletion? You can look at the advantages and disadvantages. If you look at the process control, it is excellent in these 2 settings, very poor here. Quality control, absolutely impossible once the product is going there into the patient blood, whether the filter failure has occurred or not. Number of persons, you have a lot of clinical services who would be needing the product, and all sort of levels of human training would be needed there. As I said, the filter performance is excellent in these two settings. It's very difficult to control here. Cost-wise, if you look at it, in case of indication use, the inventory have to be maintained, which some people may think it is a difficult task, but here the filtration is usually easier to tailor according to the demand. Here, the advantage is that the product would remain closed and safe. Here, it is open and then it has to be used within certain time frames. Now, the most important reason that people think that it remains elusive in our setting is the filtration cost. But let's see and do a cost analysis that how it actually translates into the cost-effective ratio. The filtration cost would involve the cost of the filters, the cost of related activities, which include the handling and human resource cost, overhead and quality control cost. If you have to, and also the cost, one should add the cost of treating adverse event, which we have seen are the clinically proven one. There are 3 of these are listed here. Okay, roughly, this is a little subsidized cost, but nevertheless, I think that should be somewhere equivalent in our country, is the cost of the red cell and platelet filters, and this is the activity cost as far as administration or preparation of the filtered blood is concerned. Now let's look at the other side of the picture, that is, if the recipients are not receiving the leukoreduced products, what cost would be incurred? For multi-transfused patient, cost of febrile reaction management, workup, that's what it translates into. For occasionally transfused, it's almost same. For multi-transfused, it's exuberant. And similarly, in a surgical and post-operative setting, the cost is quite huge. So it would make sense that if you have to weigh, if somebody is doing analysis of cost effectiveness of intervention, it would make sense in at least certain categories of the patient. That is the point I am making again and again. Now, what are the options? Over the time, the technology, and because of the introduction of universal leukoreduction in many of the countries, they have utilized and they have brought up the industry has brought in many options. These are the options of preparation of leukoreduced plasma and red cell, whereby the platelet would be lost, but this is the system of top-bottom blood bags, which is mainly used in Europe. Let's not dwell onto it, and let's go into what we do and our practices are closer to what are the same as what is done in USA. Here is a system where leukoreduction of the red cell is possible because of this, and there will be leukoreduction of plasma as well. However, there will be loss of platelets. But now, because of the difficulties of running an apheresis program, here is one of the options. This option is called whole blood leukofiltration sparing platelets. This particular filter would filter all the 3 products. And what we would get is leukoreduced red cell and leukoreduced plasma and platelets. This is a very practical option because it is almost impossible to meet the demand of platelets just through apheresis program. This is another interesting assembly and option where you can see that the whole blood can be reduced separately through a platelet filter and through a red cell filter, along with adding an additive solution. So that's another way where all 3 products can be leukoreduced. Now this is another option, interesting one, and which is probably a very practical one and a very cost-effective one, which we currently are using as well. And that is that you can prepare a pool platelets by employing this filter, and you can have, this makes it open leukoreduced, leukodepleted product. However, it can be made under closed system without compromising the shelf life if you have this magical device, which we call as sterile connecting device, because employing this would mean that the system will remain closed and making of this products, that is pooled, leukodepleted, platelet concentrate, has the same advantage, same efficacy as a apheresis platelet, and less than half the cost. In fact, this is the type of product which is now very commonly prepared in USA, and there it goes by the name of Acrodose platelets, whereby the platelets are pooled, leukoreduced, and they also have a sampling pouch for bacterial testing to increase their shelf life. If somebody asks that what is the adverse of leukoreduction, are there any problems with it? Yes, some reactions have been reported, especially with the bedside filtration, but hemovigilance data does not show that this is a very significant problem. These are the countries that have adopted universal leukoreduction. Now, what is the need of leukoreduction in Pakistan? We have a large thalassemia population requiring regular transfusion, and we know that they are not the one who can afford it easily, and that is why we have all the problems. But nevertheless, they have frequent febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction. We have a large group of multiparous pregnant females who are transfused frequently, and they suffer from high frequency of febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reactions. We have a dynamic hem-onc landscape of the country where all the platelets as well as red cell concentrates are being used in transplant setting and hem-onc oncology treatment places. Cardiac surgeries and solid organ transplant both are happening in the country. It's common to have febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction, and they also have the potential to become alloimmune to various HLA antigens. I don't think so anyone, even from the institute that I have served in, have the capacity to manage alloimmunized patients. That's the most difficult management issue that anyone can face. So there's undue and unrealistic reliance and promotion of apheresis platelet, and they can be easily substituted by leukofiltered random donor platelets instead of single donor, provided they are leukodepleted and pooled. So my recommendation would be to focus on available cost-effective leukodepletion strategies with affordable pre-storage leukofilters. Cost calculation of whole blood sparing platelet leukofilter options if the clinical services and the size of the transfusion services justify it. Separately, leukofilter red cell and platelets within blood bank setup, keep an inventory of leukoreduced red cell and platelets, and utilize this inventory for group of patients who are expected to draw maximum benefit, like in these settings, which I have illustrated before. That is, those who are chronically transfused, hem-onc setting, transplant setting, female patients, immunosuppressed patients. So in the end, I would conclude by saying that leukodepletion of certain thresholds has some important proven clinical benefits. Leukofiltration is the best strategy to prepare leukodepleted blood products. Inline leukofiltration within blood bank setting has significant advantage over bedside leukofiltration. Cost analysis justifies to maintain inventory of leukoreduced blood for patients in whom they are most indicated. Production of apheresis equivalent products with leukoreduction and pooling should be more widely known and advocated. Blood banks should take a proactive ownership for pre-storage leukoreduction, and clinical services should be involved in making the decision and realize the cost effectiveness. Pilot studies may also be carried out in collaboration with studies in our own setting to look at the viability of these recommendations that I'm making. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nuzhat, for this enlightening talk. We will take the question and answer at the end. So the last guest speaker of the session is Brigadier Mohammad Abdul Naeem. He is going to deliver a talk on massive transfusion protocol. Dr. Abdul Naeem is a graduate of Rawalpindi Medical College and has served at home and abroad in reputed institutions. For his services, he has been awarded Sitara-e-Imtiaz Military in 2017. Currently, he is working as the Commandant Armed Forces Institute of Transfusion Medicine. Sir, please, over to you.
Thank you very much. Due to shortage of time, I would be a bit quicker. Today I'm going to present a massive transfusion protocol. I'm going to give a presentation about that. Massive transfusion protocol involves the use of balance of blood products. Usually it comprises of red cell concentrates, fresh frozen plasma, platelets, and cryoprecipitates. Sometimes to this protocol we can also take help of adding some drugs. The primary aim of massive transfusion protocol is to avoid the dilutional coagulopathy. Here we must be very clear. We need to differentiate between what is massive transfusion and what is massive transfusion protocol. So, as you would be knowing that massive transfusion refers to any situation where a patient is getting a lot of blood transfusions. There are different definitions in the literature regarding massive transfusion. The common one being that it is the transfusion of more than 10 units of red cell concentrates within 24 hours. And other definitions involve shorter increments, which include transfusion of more than 5 units within 4 hours. While massive transfusion protocol refers to the transfusion of more than 10 or more packed red cells within 24 hours period, and it is done to limit the complications and limit critical hypoperfusion till the surgical hemostasis is achieved. When is it required? Massive transfusion protocols are basically designed and validated primarily for the management of traumatic hemorrhage. Traumatic hemorrhage is basically either blunt or sharp. Most hospitals like ours may have a single massive transfusion protocol which is used across various clinical settings, and such clinical settings include generally management of obstetric hemorrhage, operative bleeding, and massive gastrointestinal bleeding. One of the most important elements of massive transfusion protocol is the initial evaluation of the patient, whether the patient does require this protocol or it doesn't. In this context, there is no simple criteria to label a person whether it has to undergo this protocol. And ultimately, the initiation of massive transfusion protocol is based on the clinical judgment. That is very important to note. And in the clinical judgment, generally the following aspects are considered: how unstable is the patient, how rapidly is the patient bleeding, what is the expected trajectory of this type of bleeding, and most importantly, is the patient definitely in hemorrhagic shock. The hemoglobin level, which is still generally used as the benchmark, is not the correct element to be noted, because hemoglobin takes hours to fall after bleeding. Consequently, checking the hemoglobin has little role in determining whether a person should go massive transfusion protocol. Again, hypotension is usually a very late manifestation of hemorrhage. Worsening hypotension and vasopressor requirement should have a prompt consideration if you want to initiate a massive transfusion protocol. The ratio of blood products which are used in the MTP are in the ratio of 1:1:1, which comprises of RCCs, platelets, and fresh frozen plasma. These packs are stored in a blood bank, and I would be telling you the different protocols later on also. In some places, it was advocated that a ratio of 1:1:2 for the RCCs, platelets, and fresh flowing plasma should be used. But to cut it short, a trial was conducted in 2015, PRO-PPR trial, which has proven that a ratio of 1:1:1 reduces mortality, morbidity in the patients who undergo these transfusions. So here you can see that different arrangements of MTP packs are in place and have been used. In our practice at Armed Forces Institute of Transfusion, we usually have a pack of 4-4-4, meaning that we have 4 RCCs with 4 FFPs and 4 units of platelets. The RCC kept is usually of the group ORH negative, while AB plasma and platelets are kept. In package number 3, we do include 4 packs of cryoprecipitate. Here again, the suggested algorithm of MTP is shown. Here it is projected that a senior clinician ultimately determines whether the patient meets the criteria for MTP. The reason for that is it is very important to avoid the wastage of blood products, because once an MTP is activated, you thaw the plasma FFPs, and if they are not used, they go to waste. And when a clinician initiates or thinks that the patient may be requiring an MTP, an urgent full blood count coagulation screen, including PT-INR, PTTK, and fibrinogen, along with the biochemistry and blood gas analysis, is sent, and the lab or the transfusion center is notified to activate the MTP. Once an MTP is activated, ideally the products should reach the patient within 15 minutes. You immediately start thawing the FFPs and the cryoprecipitates if required. And in our setup, the products reach within 20 minutes to the patient. Then obviously it is shown that the reason for initiating is to improve the oxygenation, cardiac output, tissue perfusion, and the metabolic state of the patient. The patient is monitored continuously, and then when you activate the transfusion center, the lab staff or the general lab is notified, and they should be ready to receive the samples and give the results of the monitoring within 30 minutes. The targets are twofold: short-term and long-term. The short-term targets include achievement of the hematocrit. The platelets should be kept above a level of 50,000. Similarly, the fibrinogen levels should be more than 100 milligrams per deciliter. And similarly, you can see the long-term targets for the coagulation results. Monitoring coagulation while MTP is being given is very important, and one potential exception to doing the coagulation profile in the lab has been the use of intraoperative thromboelastography, but multiple trials have shown that the near point testing or thromboelastographic techniques have no significant advantage over the other techniques which are being used. Then we must, when we initiate an MTP, keep in mind the known coagulation abnormalities a patient may have. For example, the patient may have a low fibrinogen level initially or may be on certain drugs like warfarin. Then additional blood products may be indicated in such cases. This is more pertaining to the clinical aspect. A quick access to the venous system by using various intravenous devices is of critical importance in such patients. And here you can see multiple devices have been suggested, and the personnel obviously who are managing such patient must have at hand these devices to make MTP successful. Then you need to, while placing these devices, you must ensure that the sterility is achieved in toto, that should be 100%, and in most cases the bleeding will be controlled within 24 hours, and then these devices can be replaced in time. In such cases, it's very important to note that these patients need to be intubated most of the time, and it is the best practice is if the intubation is going to be carried out to give a round of massive transfusion. For example, 6 units of RCCs, 6 units of platelets, and 6 units of FFP should be given prior to intubation. As initially crystalloid resuscitation is given in case of hemorrhagic shock, and it may dilute out the coagulation factors and the erythrocytes. And the best practice which evidence has generated is that to treat the hemorrhagic resuscitation or shock with the blood products if available. One very important aspect is to maintain adequate fibrinogen levels, and recently the guidelines have suggested that adequate levels comprise of a level of 150-200 milligram per deciliter. And the fibrinogens can be supplemented by the administration of fibrinogen concentrates or given by giving cryoprecipitates. 10 units of cryoprecipitates increase the fibrinogen level by 75 milligrams per deciliter. Different trials have shown tranexamic acid as a useful adjunct, especially in case of obstetric hemorrhage, and has shown good results in early traumatic bleeding. The typical dose is 1 gram IV given immediately, which may be followed by infusions of 1 gram over 8 hours and may be repeated after 24 hours. And it has been shown that this is very effective if, especially in cases of penetrating or blunt trauma, if they are given within 3 hours of the trauma. Again, if the person has got pre-existing coagulopathy, it is very important to treat that. Warfarin or anticoagulation, if it is the patient is taking warfarin, you may need the prothrombin complex concentrates to be treated. If a person has a previous platelet dysfunction anomaly, then desmopressin may have to be used. The purpose of telling that is that whatever center is managing that must have these medications at hand. Then similarly, regarding post-MTP lab evaluations, the lab should be good enough in managing doing the electrolytes and the complete blood counts and the coagulation profile and reporting them back as early as possible. So, to sum it up, the target is to maintain an adequate level of platelets that is more than 50,000. Fibrinogen in such patients should be kept over 100, and the INR below 2. One very important aspect is that you need to have blood warmers when you are going through this massive transfusion protocols, because hypothermia has been shown to be a major cause of mortality and morbidity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for this enlightening talk. And at the end, I would like to start the question answer session. A few questions that I have received. One is for Dr. Hassan Abbas Zahid. Sir, this is a question I think you have received it as well. And this is from Dr. Fazle Rahim from Timikara, and he has asked, in government hospital, there is no facility for component separation, screening, and cross-matching of blood. If it is brought to private facility for component separation, if platelet concentrate is required, the hospital blood bank doesn't accept those red cells. Maybe keep that remaining components in our blood bank refrigerator for thalassemia patients to be issued free of cost.
I don't think this question is related to any talk, but if a hospital, public sector hospital, doesn't have the facility for screening, cross-matching, or storing blood, it should not be handling blood, and let the other centers where these facilities exist, let them handle all this work, and they can transport the blood product where it is required for transfusion.
Thank you so much, sir. The next question is for Dr. Sabah Jamal. This is from Dr. Bushra Muiz from Khan University. She has more of a comment that we do need to know and educate our clinicians to raise their transfusion thresholds to decrease the burden on blood banks. And moreover, we also require the curriculum change for our undergraduate and the postgraduate students. Any comment, ma'am?
Agree.
Dr. Sabah?
I agree with her comment.
Totally. Thank you so much. With this, should I conclude, Dr. Nuzhat?
I think if the panelists have their expert commentary would be very welcome. We can start off with Dr. Hassan and then Dr. Nisar. That will be very valuable to know their comments during this session.
Please.
I think this was an excellent session, which included a couple of presentations from young investigators and 3 presentations from experienced transfusion experts. I especially appreciate the update from Dr. Sabah Jamal, in which he had recapped the transfusion scenario in the country and the reforms process since the last decade and the planning for the future. So let's hope that with the work in progress, the reform process is extended to the uncovered geographical areas in Pakistan in the near future.
Thank you, sir. Sir, Professor Dr. Nisar Ahmed, can you please comment or give suggestions?
Yes. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I think first of all the congratulations to Professor General Pervez and Brigadier Nuzhat for wonderful HaimCon 2021, because this is first time we have the total virtual conference. It's a very good experience. At the same time, we have the very exciting session. We have 3 free papers. One by the Aisha on neonatal thrombocytopenia from Jamshoro. I think it's a wonderful presentation by a young hematologist. Our experience in children's hospital is different. We have only less than 5% patient presented with severe or critical thrombocytopenia and the platelet transfusion. So rarely we transfuse platelets in our neonates in our setup, because we have the largest neonatology unit in Pakistan. We have 100-bedded neonatology at a children's hospital. So we have a lot of cases of thrombocytopenia, but most of them are not critical. Most of these patients are due to sepsis, early or late onset sepsis, and they are settled with the antibiotics. The second paper by the Dr. Kamal, the paper by Dr. Iram, again, this is a wonderful presentation by young hematologists, and the new, especially is a new one. First time they have done the A2 incident in our population, especially genotyping and serological finding. It's a wonderful paper. And then we have three guest speakers. There's no doubt. The one by the Dr. Sabah Jamal, excellent overview of the blood transfusion service in Pakistan, the gaps, the recommendations, and way forward. Recently, just to Dr. Sabah, recently we have large number of meeting with the Minister of Health, Punjab, and Secretary Health, and we are focusing on the Blood Transfusion Authority, and we have developed the district blood as well as the divisional blood headquarters for the Blood Transfusion Act and transfusion committees. And they have agreed to have the more and more seats for the hematologists in these blood transfusion authority. And they have also agreed to look after all the blood banks in teaching hospitals by the Department of Pathology under supervision of the hematologists. They have issued this letter of recommendation to all district hospitals and teaching hospitals that it should be a part of the pathology department and they should look after by the hematologist. Because I have given them the model of the children's hospital because we established transfusion medicine in the 1998 under the Department of the Hematology. And our department is run by the three qualified hematologists. And they accepted that model and now they are going to transform into all teaching hospitals of the Punjab. Similarly, they also agreed to have the more and more seats for the hematologists in whole province of Punjab. I think there are 18 professors of hematology will be posted in Punjab in teaching hospitals. We have again a very excellent presentation by Brigadier Nusrat, again giving the importance of the leukocyte depletion filter in our setup, especially when you are dealing with the oncology patients, chronic transfer dependent patients. It's excellent view on the leukocyte. Again, not last but least, the presentation by Brigadier Naim on MTP. Again, I think this MTP should be initiated and implemented in all teaching hospitals. I request all the transfusion experts in different teaching hospitals, they should have the MTP in their protocols and should be implemented in a spirit. I think it's a wonderful experience having this symposium, and especially the on transfusion medicine, which is very close to our heart because we are striving for the establishment of transfusion medicine in our setup in Pakistan. I think we are moving forward. Now, a lot of people are in testing and they are joining the blood transfusion medicine as a specialty. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Inshallah, hoping for the best. And at the end, Colonel Yazdani, please for a brief comment.
Thank you very much. Actually, after the comments of Professor Hassan Abbas Zahir and Professor Nisar, it's very difficult for me because they have already summarized, and I will also be thankful to PSH for inviting me as a panelist. Actually, all these talks delivered by experts were actually very close to our hearts. Madam Nusrat knows that I was insisting when we served together regarding the pre-storage leukodepletion, and there was the problems because of the cost and everything. So I am already convinced that we should start it. And thank you very much for Dr. Sabah for taking us from past to present and then hope for future. And one of the important aspects of starting off MPhil in transfusion medicine is actually we are looking forward. There are rays of hope. And again, I am really thankful to invite me, and I am really got benefited from the enlightened talks of my seniors and experts on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. And this comes to the end of this session. I'm very, very thankful to all the speakers and our panelists. And I must congratulate again Brigadier Nuzul for this wonderful experience. Thank you so much, ma'am. And there will be a lunch break. And after the lunch break at 12:40, there will be a journal body meeting of PSH. So please, the link has been shared in the PSH group. You can all join from there. Thank you so much, and Allah Hafiz from my side.
Thank you very much.